I want to talk in this next segment about the conservative judicial philosophy of originalism or original intent. Now, I've suggested in the past that this philosophy, by the way, very cogently articulated by Robert Bork, my former colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, especially in his book, The Tempting of America. If you want a kind of erudite exposition of originalism, that's where you can find it. But what I've suggested is that originalism has problems. One of the problems is its tendency to defer to the legislature. By the way, that's why Justice Roberts voted to affirm Obamacare. He said it's not the court's job to strike it down if the legislature wants it. And if the legislature kind of got it slightly wrong, well, maybe we can just fix it and call it a tax. So originalism has caused problems for our side. Not just because Roberts, quote, sold out, it's because Roberts was actually implementing the philosophy that he defended when he went up for his nomination. Now, it's a very interesting article in Slate that's talking about the Supreme Court and the recent gun rights case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And the article goes on to make the point that when you look at the history of gun rights, the way that gun rights going back into English common law, but then coming to the colonies and continuing past the American founding, the theme of the article is that there is no unambiguous, clear-cut affirmation of the Second Amendment. And so what the article is saying, this is an article by Saul Cornell, it says that, yeah, the Second Amendment does seem to emphatically say that the right to own arms cannot be abridged. But the writer says that no right is as absolute as that. And in order to figure out what a right means, you've got to look at the original kind of soil that gave rise to this right. And he goes on to point out that under English common law, you were allowed to own a firearm, but there was a sharp distinction between owning a firearm in private, on your farm, for example, and in the public square, in the market. A whole different set of rules applied. He goes on to argue that even in American history, there's a complex history in which firearms have at times been regulated. In fact, very interestingly, the Democratic South sought to restrict blacks from owning firearms because they didn't want blacks to have any kind of defense against the Ku Klux Klan and other racial terrorism being launched under the aegis of the Democratic Party. And then Saul Cornell concludes in this article, he goes, so these conservatives on the court who talk about originalism don't really believe it because they're not willing to look at the original intentions and the history and the context of the Second Amendment, which would, if you did look at it, modify the Second Amendment. In other words, it would show that the Second Amendment isn't quite as absolute, that the concrete judicial history of the Second Amendment would narrow the Second Amendment at least somewhat. Now, I don't want to argue about the history of gun rights per se. I want to make the broader point that maybe originalism is a doctrine that has sort of outlived its usefulness. And so in responding to the article, I tweeted, because essentially the article is saying that the Supreme Court is sort of wink, wink, ignoring the originalism it pretends to profess. And I go, great. I say, this means that we are focused on winning cases, not vindicating some abstract theory about how to read the Constitution. I say, to heck with originalism. What we actually want are free speech, equality of rights under the law, gun rights, and the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That's our judicial philosophy. Now, here comes, and I knew this was coming, but here comes a guy who's not unfriendly. But he goes, Dinesh, it's wrong when the court's left makes it up as they go along in order to justify their political whims, and it's just as wrong if the right does it too. So here we have this direct appeal to sort of, Dinesh, are you giving up your conservative principles? He goes, the right must not stray from originalism. And so to tweak him a little bit, I replied thus. I say, look, what is the original meaning of Hamlet? What is the original meaning of the Bible? In other words, is there any meaning of a text other than what's in the text? You want to know what Hamlet means? Read the play. Don't ask, well, what was Shakespeare thinking when he wrote it? What were his motivations? No one knows what they are. What were the motivations of the ancient Hebrew writers when they sat down to write the Bible down? We don't know. What we know is what they wrote. That's the Bible. What's in the Bible? That's my point. And here's another guy. This guy is from the left. He goes, shh, Dinesh, you're not supposed to admit that Republicans are so openly unprincipled. To which I reply, on the contrary, our principles are free speech, civil liberties, equality of rights under the law, gun rights, and respect for human dignity. In other words, originalism isn't our principle. These are our principles. The reason we were attached to originalism is it was the means to deliver these ends. And I guess what I'm saying is, let's stand on the ends themselves. Let's defend our actual principles instead of some dubious procedure that may or may not vindicate them.